I worked the late shift at a commercial printing press on the industrial outskirts of the city. It's a miserable job, mostly consisting of standing over massive, ink-smelling machines and listening to the rhythmic, deafening thud of paper being stamped for 8 hours straight. The only perk is that the pay is slightly better than daytime warehouse work. The massive downside is the commute. I rely on public transit. The industrial park is serviced by exactly one bus line, the 42 North. The last scheduled pickup is at 11:45 p.m. If you miss it, you are stranded until the morning routes begin at 5:30 a.m. It was a Tuesday night in mid-November. The weather was a punishing, freezing sleet that coated the sidewalks in a slick layer of black ice. My relief was 20 minutes late clocking in, which meant I was late clocking out. By the time I sprinted out of the loading dock doors and down the hill to the concrete bus shelter, my watch read 11:49 p.m. The street was completely empty. The digital transit marquee inside the shelter, which usually displays the ETA of the next arrival, was blank. I pulled out my phone and opened the city transit app. Route 42 North. Next arrival 5:30 a.m. I cursed loudly, kicking the metal frame of the shelter. I was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and facing a 5-hour wait in sub-freezing temperatures. Calling a rideshare from this part of town at this hour would cost me a full day's wages, assuming a driver would even accept the fare. I sat down on the freezing metal bench, pulled my hood over my head, and braced myself for a miserable night. I must have dozed off, lulled by the hypnotic sound of the sleet hitting the plexiglass roof. I woke up with a start. The distinct, heavy rumble of a diesel engine was vibrating through the soles of my boots. I looked up. Cutting through the freezing rain and the dense orange fog of the streetlights were two massive halogen headlights. A city bus was pulling up to the curb. I scrambled to my feet, my frozen joints protesting. I looked at the digital clock on my phone screen. 12:14 a.m. It made no sense. The app had said the route was dead until morning. I looked at the bright orange LED display above the windshield of the bus as it hissed to a stop in front of me. Usually, the display reads 42 North, downtown. This display was blank. No route number, no destination. Just a solid line of unlit black pixels. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the cold. At that moment, I would have gotten on a garbage truck if it meant getting out of the freezing sleet. The hydraulic doors folded open with a sharp gasp of compressed air. I stepped up into the warm, dimly lit interior. "Hey, thanks," I mumbled, digging my frozen fingers into my pocket for my transit card. I thought the line was shut down for the night. The driver didn't respond. He didn't even move. He was slumped slightly forward, both hands resting on the massive steering wheel. He was wearing the standard issue blue city transit uniform, but his thick winter coat collar was pulled all the way up, and a dark cap was pulled low over his forehead. His face was entirely obscured in the shadows of the cab. I tapped my card against the electronic fare reader. The screen was dead. It didn't beep. I looked at the driver again. He slowly raised his right hand and pointed a gloved finger toward the back of the bus. "Just sit down." I nodded, too cold and exhausted to question it. I turned and walked down the aisle. The interior of the bus was an older model. The seats were covered in a faded, itchy brown fabric that the city had phased out almost a decade ago. The fluorescent lights overhead were dim, flickering with a sickly, pale yellow hue. And the bus was far more crowded than it should have been. For 12:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, in the middle of a dead industrial zone, I expected the bus to be completely empty. but nearly every row had at least one passenger. There were maybe 20 people on board. I walked halfway down the aisle and took an empty window seat next to the rear exit doors. I dropped my backpack on the floor, slouched against the cold glass of the window, and let out a long sigh of relief as the bus pulled away from the curb. It took about 10 minutes for the relief to fade and the unease to set in. It started with the silence. Thick, unnatural, wrong. A bus with 20 people on it is never completely silent. People cough. They shift in their plastic seats. They sniffle. You hear the tinny bleed of music from cheap earbuds, or the soft tapping of thumbs on smartphone screens. There was none of that. Not a single sound. The only sound was the heavy, monotonous drone of the diesel engine and the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers. I sat up slowly and looked around. The passenger directly across the aisle from me was an older woman in a heavy, moth-eaten wool coat. She was sitting perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring directly at the back of the seat in front of her. She wasn't holding a phone. She wasn't looking out the window. She was just sitting there, completely still. I looked at the row ahead of her. A young man in a stained gray hoodie and construction boots. Same posture, same rigid forward-facing stare. I scanned the rest of the bus carefully. Every single passenger was locked in the exact same pose. No one was moving, no one was sleeping. And then I realized something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. No one was breathing. Not one chest moved. It was freezing outside, and the heater in the bus was barely working. The air inside the cabin was cold enough that I could see small, white plumes of my own breath every time I exhaled. But I was the only one. 20 people, and not a single other cloud of condensation in the air. My heart started to beat faster, harder. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I wanted to look at the map and see exactly where we were. No service. I pressed my face against the window, trying to look past the reflection of the flickering overhead lights. The sleet was coming down harder now, but I could still make out the shapes passing by outside. We weren't on the route anymore. The 42 North takes a left at the end of the industrial park and heads onto the interstate toward the downtown transit center. But out the window, I didn't see the massive concrete pillars of the highway overpass. I saw dense, unbroken lines of towering pine trees. We were on a 2-lane rural road. "Hey," I said, my voice cracking the absolute silence of the cabin. No one reacted. The woman across the aisle didn't blink. "Excuse me," I said louder, leaning forward and tapping the construction worker in the gray hoodie on the shoulder. His body was impossibly stiff, like dried wood. When I touched his shoulder, he didn't flinch. Instead, his entire torso slowly rotated toward me, as if his spine was made of rusted iron. I saw his face, and my stomach dropped. His skin was a pale, waxy gray, completely devoid of blood. His lips were slightly parted, dry and cracked. But it was his eyes that made me recoil. They were entirely clouded over a milky, opaque white. He was dead. Completely. He had been dead for a very long time. I scrambled backward, my breath hitching, pressing myself against the window, my chest heaving. I looked wildly around the bus. The older woman across the aisle slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes were the same milky white. Her skin was the texture of dry parchment. Slowly, one by one, the other passengers in the surrounding rows began to turn their heads. The slow, synchronized movement was accompanied by the faint, dry sound of stiff fabrics rustling and tendons popping. Dozens of blind, milky eyes locked onto me at once. "Stop the bus!" I screamed, bolting up from my seat. I lunged for the yellow cord that ran along the top of the windows, the one used to signal a stop. I yanked it violently. Ding! The small red stop requested sign lit up at the front of the bus. The bus didn't slow down. It didn't even hesitate. The engine didn't shift gears. It just kept accelerating into the dark, tree-lined road. I stumbled down the aisle, pushing past the dead, staring passengers. I reached the rear exit doors. I grabbed the yellow rubber handles and pushed with all my body weight, trying to force the pneumatic doors open. They didn't budge, like they were welded shut. "Let me off," I yelled, abandoning the rear doors and running up the aisle toward the driver. "Stop the damn bus!" I reached the front of the bus. I grabbed the metal railing that separated the driver's cab from the aisle. I said, "Stop!" I grabbed the driver by the shoulder of his thick winter coat and spun him around. The coat was empty. There was nothing inside it. There was no body inside the uniform. The cap fell onto the driver's seat, resting on the collar of a coat that was propped up by absolutely nothing. The massive steering wheel was turning on its own, making minute adjustments as the bus navigated the dark, winding road. I backed away, my mind fracturing as the impossibility of the situation crushed whatever rational thought I had left. I looked out the massive windshield. The road ahead wasn't a road anymore. The trees were thinning, dissolving into a thick, impenetrable gray fog. The asphalt beneath the headlights was disappearing completely, turning into nothing but a dark, swirling void. The bus wasn't driving on a road. It was just moving forward into a massive, endless expanse of nothingness. The red stop requested light flickered off. My legs suddenly felt heavy. Too heavy. The adrenaline drained out of me all at once, replaced by a cold, thick lethargy that settled deep into my bones. The frantic beating of my heart began to slow down. I didn't want to run anymore. I couldn't. I didn't want to scream. The thought of escaping suddenly felt exhausting, pointless. I turned around. The passengers were no longer looking at me. They had all returned to their original, rigid postures, staring blankly toward the front of the bus. I turned and walked slowly back down the aisle. My boots felt like they were made of lead. The cold air inside the cabin didn't bother me anymore. In fact, I couldn't feel the cold at all. I couldn't feel my fingers. I reached the empty window seat next to the rear doors. I sat down. I placed my hands neatly in my lap without thinking. I leaned my back against the itchy brown fabric of the seat. I looked at the window, at my reflection. I didn't see the fog outside anymore. I just saw my own reflection in the glass. My skin already looked pale. The color was draining from my eyes, turning the irises into a cloudy, milky white. I didn't blink. I couldn't. I just stared straight ahead, listening to the heavy, monotonous drone of the diesel engine, waiting for the bus to make its next stop, wherever that was.